It is important not to be discouraged if you don't pass at this stage, because you can ask for a review or challenge this if you believe it's been done incorrectly. And somebody only has to have one of those characteristics to be deemed to have a primary health need. But this part is the most important, and it should be very, very detailed. You could have, for example, two people with the same levels of need. One could be found eligible and one not, just because the way their needs present is differently and how they interact. So don't be afraid to correct things that are wrong, or ask questions if you don't understand some of the medical terminology
Oh, well, I
freely.
suppose the main thing just to remember is that this is all about health needs. So this is not about a diagnosis. Yes, that has a play, but it's what those needs are a result of that diagnosis. It's
Yeah.
not about finances. It's not about how much money you may have or what income you have. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Understanding Care Funding, the podcast where we demystify the legal and practical side of funding long-term care in England and Wales. I'm Lisa. I'm a partner and head of the nursing care department at Hugh James. I'm joined today by my colleague Michelle, who is also who is a solicitor and a legal director in the nursing care department at Hugh James. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Lisa.
Today, we're going to be covering a big one: how to navigate NHS Continuing Healthcare, or CHC as it's known, but in particular, the assessment process. What families can expect, the red flags to watch out for, and what to do if you're found ineligible. Does that sound okay, Michelle?
Absolutely. There is a lot of confusion and, unfortunately, a lot of poor advice out there around this area. So hopefully today we can walk you through step by step.
Okay, so we'll start with the basics, shall we? When does someone actually get assessed for NHS Continuing Healthcare?
Good question. So there are a couple of triggers that can trigger an assessment. So after somebody's discharged from hospital, for example, when somebody enters a new care home or a care home for the first time, or any change in their health from previous. So if there's been a significant deterioration, for example, a fall or a stroke, anything like that, that could trigger the need for a new assessment or a first assessment for continuing healthcare. It should be done when there's reason to believe that somebody could have a primary health need.
Yeah, so we've discussed in previous episodes about what the criteria is for continuing healthcare, and is really if it is based on a primary health need. So a new assessment can be triggered if there has been a change in need. So when someone is assessed, what is the first step that families should expect?
The first step is usually the checklist assessment. Now, the checklist assessment is a screening tool that's used sometimes by the NHS, sometimes by a social worker, to decide whether or not a person's needs are sufficient to warrant a full assessment. It is important not to be discouraged if you don't pass at this stage, because you can ask for a review or challenge this if you believe it's been done incorrectly.
And the checklist tool is on purpose. It's very low. It's only to basically screen out those that are obviously not eligible for funding. That's right, isn't it?
That's right, yes. And so if the checklist is positive, what happens next, Lisa?
Well, then, if the checklist is positive, you're informed that a full assessment needs to be done, which is where you get into more detail about the individual's care needs. That full assessment is called a decision support tool, which we'll go through in more detail in a moment, and is set by the Department of Health. So if you look at if you go on the Department of Health website, you'll find a copy of that decision support tool. Now, that is a more detailed assessment, And that assessment tool, the tool is only a guide, but it is completed by a multidisciplinary team, and that you're looking across 12 care domains, where you're looking at things like mobility, cognition, behavior, breathing, drugs, nutrition, for example. Okay.
So
So
what would be a multidisciplinary team then,
so
so
the
people can
multidis so
understand?
yeah, it's focused on an individual's. So for someone that's in a care home, for example, and they suffer with dementia, they've got other physical needs. The people that you'd expect to be in that multidisciplinary team is a nurse assessor from the local health authority, so from the ICB in England or the Health Board in Wales. You'd also expect there to be someone from the care home, someone that knows that individual well and knows what their care needs are. And also, it's very important that the family are involved in that assessment process as well, because they know their relative better than anyone else and are able to assist in identifying what their needs are. And also, there's usually social services involvement in as well. If someone has, specialist needs or have, for example, the diabetes team involvement or Parkinson's nurse, they should also be part of the assessment process. And it should be a way that they all gather information in relation to those 12 care domains. So, with regards to the decision support tool, it's not there as a scoring system, is it, Michelle?
No, it's not. As you mentioned, it's a way of bringing together all of the information. Whilst they do give levels of need under the care domains, as Lisa mentioned, once that process has been completed, the most important part of the assessment process then takes place. And that's where they gather everything together and look at the totality of a person's needs. And that's when they determine whether or not somebody has a primary health need. And they look at certain characteristics then to determine if there's eligibility. And those characteristics are nature, intensity, complexity, and unpredictability. And somebody only has to have one of those characteristics to be deemed to have a primary health need. But this part is the most important, and it should be very, very detailed. So there should be detailed explanations under each of those characteristics to explain either why somebody is meeting that characteristic or why they aren't.
And that's, we've said that this isn't a scoring tool, but in a way, sometimes it can also be a scoring tool, can't they? Can't it, to be directly eligible? So, do you want to give some examples of what you would expect to find eligible decision?
Yeah. So the guidance within the decision support tool itself suggests that if somebody is assessed as having one priority level of need or two severe levels of need, that should indicate eligibility for continuing healthcare. But in our experience, Lisa, we don't see many of those cases in day-to-day cases. What you often see will be somebody being assessed as having a severe level of need, maybe in one area, and a number of other highs and moderates, or even highs and moderates combined. And they are the cases then where it's very, very important that you look at that primary health needs test, the characteristics I just mentioned, and eligibility can then be found based on those. You could have, for example, two people with the same levels of need. One could be found eligible and one not, just because the way their needs present is differently and how they interact. So it's not as simple as saying, well, this person had one severe and four highs and is eligible, therefore the next person with those levels will be eligible, because it's different, and it is about that individual and how they are presenting.
And we know that the interpretation of those different levels as well can differ between individuals, because the descriptors under those levels, are subjective, which does lead to then erroneous decisions being made. And it's, we know that there's a postcode lottery, which NHS England statistics show us, and that's what leads. So it's very important, isn't it, for, families can go through this assessment process themselves, or they can instruct solicitors to assist them, but that everyone is familiar with that tool that's going to be used
Yes. Yeah.
by the multidisciplinary team in assessing the individual for CHC. So, I mean, we know that things can go wrong in the process. So, what are some of the red flags that we see? What people should be looking out for?
Well, there are plenty in our experience. Unfortunately, we see these types of things every day. So one of the first ones would be assessments done without the family's knowledge. And unfortunately, this does happen, even if people are aware of family involvement, that they have relevant legal authority to act on their relatives' behalf. It still happens, unfortunately. And this can cause problems because there are quite strict time frames for challenging certain assessments and decisions. And obviously, if people don't know about those, that can mean a case can be time barred, or it can mean you've got very little time to challenge.
Yeah. And another one, isn't it, where it isn't truly a multidisciplinary team that's assessing. So, for example, it might just be one nurse from the ICB or Health Board in Wales, rather than two professionals from two different disciplines. So that's also a red flag, because it should be truly multidisciplinary. And I suppose the main thing, one of the main issues that we see is that it contradicts any clinical evidence that we've seen. So that they don't have a full understanding of the individual's needs, but also the records from the care home or any GP records or hospital records if they've been in hospital. The information within the decision support tool contradicts that.
Yeah. And another one that goes back is quite similar to not being aware of the assessment. It is the family not being allowed to participate in the assessment or told they can't attend. And again, this may be an excuse for this may be that you don't have the relevant power of attorney or deputy order, but that's not sufficient reason for the family not to be involved. It's you have to look at the individual's best interests and make a decision. This is particularly the case when you're assessing somebody that doesn't have mental capacity. There can be issues when an individual hasn't appointed anybody to act on their behalf, but that doesn't mean the family have no rights to participate at all. Under the best interest principle, it would be in the best interest to allow the family to participate and contribute to any assessment process.
And these procedural flaws can be grounds to appeal, can't they? So this is when you need to start thinking about whether you need to seek advice, or that you're challenging, go back to the ICB or the Health Board to challenge them on the assessment process. But it is red flags that families should be aware of. And I suppose even after the assessment has been done, we have also seen where it's been recommended that eligibility should be found by the multidisciplinary team, but then has not been accepted when it's gone for ratification by the ICB or Health Board. And that is a big red flag, because we know that it's clear and it's clear in the guidance that decisions should be accepted in all but the most exceptional cases. So that is a big flag that should be raised.
Yeah.
So if a decision finds eligibility and it's accepted by the NHS body, funding will be awarded, and then they'll liaise with the long-term placement to ensure that funding is put in place. And I suppose just a small thing we'll flag up here, but something we may talk about in another episode because we haven't got time now, is that when someone is eligible for funding, they should not be paying for a top-up when it's NHS funding. But unfortunately, we are seeing more and more so now where care homes are asking for top-ups from families, even where CHC has been awarded. So that's just another red flag to raise.
Yeah.
So the next point, I suppose, is if you're not found eligible and the next steps. We're going to talk about that in the next episode. But just one thing I think we should just let people know now is how important, which you've already mentioned, Michelle, is the fact that once you get that decision letter and you're not happy, the time is ticking. So you have 6 months in England to submit an appeal, but 28 days in Wales. And the clock starts ticking straight away. And it's only in the very most serious cases that they'll extend that. That's right, Mish, isn't it?
It is, yes. And obviously, you have to get quite a bit of information together to be in a position to appeal. It's not enough to just simply say, I disagree with the assessment, I disagree with the decision. You have to explain why, and you have to produce evidence. And really, at this stage, it can get quite complicated.
So before we wrap up, I think it'd be useful for the listeners to have a few tips when they're preparing to go through this process. So what's your tips?
Well, when we're preparing to participate in an assessment, we try and get as much evidence as we can. So we ask the care provider, so if they're in a nursing home, the nursing home, if they're at home, that the care agency for copies of the care plans, copies of any relevant assessments, because they are useful in evidencing the levels of need. Obviously, attend the assessment itself if you're able to. Often these assessments can be done remotely. So if you're not physically able to attend the assessment, ask if it can be done via sort of Microsoft Teams or Zoom, and take notes of the assessment as well. So take notes of what levels of need were agreed, because as Lisa said, sometimes when these assessments go to ratification, they can be changed. And don't be afraid to speak out in these assessments. If you disagree with something that's said, often things can be noted down wrong. So what's written down in a note might be incorrect, and you know the patient best. So don't be afraid to correct things that are wrong, or ask questions if you don't understand some of the medical terminology. For example, if you don't know what an abbreviation is for, it's better to ask what it means rather than be confused.
And I suppose, sorry, Mish, but
I was just going to say, I can't think of anything else really.
Well, I suppose the main thing just to remember is that this is all about health needs. So this is not about a diagnosis. Yes, that has a play, but it's what those needs are a result of that diagnosis. It's not about finances. It's not about how much money you may have or what income you have. This is purely about your needs. And it's not about location either. It's not about where you're being cared for. It's purely about what your health needs are and the care that you need as a result of it. I think that's very important for people to remember. So that brings us to the end of this episode. There's a lot to think about, I think, and I think the listeners will appreciate that step-to-step breakdown. It is hopefully going to make families more confident in going through that assessment process. It's been time well spent by us to go through that so that they know how to prepare the red flags to look out for.
Hopefully it's been useful for somebody. That's it for today's episode. So don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and send in your questions. We may answer them in a future episode. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.